Right now, as you watch this, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strip of water that controls roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply, has just gone through a ceasefire after being shut down for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Brent crude hit $125 a barrel. Gas crossed $4 a gallon in the United States. Airline flights got canceled. Countries started rationing fuel. The word that every economist on every channel kept whispering, stagflation, started showing up everywhere. And most people watching the news had no idea what that word even means. But here is what nobody on cable news told you. This has happened before, almost exactly like this. And the last time it did, it quietly destroyed the financial future of an entire generation of working Americans and British families, not in one dramatic crash, not in a single market collapse that made front-page news, but slowly, invisibly, over about a decade, while people were just trying to live their lives. Welcome to the Vault Historian, and today we are going back to 1973. If you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to take the financial stories that are dominating today's headlines and show you the historical script that was already written. Because history does not repeat exactly, but the financial mechanisms, the human decisions, the political moves and countermoves, they rhyme so closely that once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Make sure you hit like and subscribe right now, because we are just getting started, and what we are about to unpack is going to fundamentally change how you understand what is happening to your money today. Let us go back 53 years. Let us go back to a world that feels, in a lot of ways, uncomfortably familiar. It is October 1973. America is tired. The Vietnam War has been grinding on for years, costing the country billions of dollars and enormous political capital. Richard Nixon is in the White House, but his presidency is already bleeding from a wound called Watergate. Inflation is already creeping upward, not dramatically, but enough that people are starting to notice their grocery bills getting a little harder each month. The economy is what economists call overheated. The Federal Reserve has been running loose monetary policy. Sound familiar yet? Hold that thought. And then on October 6th, everything changes. Egypt and Syria launch a massive coordinated surprise attack against Israel. It's Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and Israeli forces are caught almost completely off guard. The conflict becomes known as the Yom Kippur War, and within days, the Nixon administration makes a decision that will echo through the wallets of ordinary Americans for the next decade. They authorize a massive military resupply operation to Israel called Operation Nickelgrass, funneling weapons, ammunition, and equipment worth over $2 billion to keep Israel in the fight. The Arab world watches this, and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, a deeply religious man with enormous leverage over the world's oil supply, decides America needs to feel the consequences. On October 19, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announces a total oil embargo against the United States. No more oil, not a reduction, not a warning, a full cutoff, combined with coordinated production cuts across the Arab world. And just like that, the most powerful economy on Earth finds itself staring down an energy weapon it had never fully prepared for. Now here is the part that most people do not realize, and this is where it gets truly remarkable. The embargo itself, in pure barrel terms, was not actually that enormous. Arab OPEC members only supplied about 12% of U.S. oil imports at the time. But here's what made it catastrophic. The psychological effect was total. The moment word spread that Arab nations had cut supply, panic set in. Traders drove prices up. Refineries started holding back inventory, gas stations ran dry, and the price of crude oil went from about $3 a barrel before the embargo to nearly $12 a barrel by January 1974. That's a 300% increase in 90 days. Think about that. Now look at what Hormuz just did to crude prices, from $64 a barrel before the crisis to over $125, almost exactly the same proportional shock, just playing out in 2026 dollars. The mechanism is identical, the psychology is identical, the vulnerability is identical. But we're only just getting started, because the price spike was not the real story.
The real story is what happened next. America in 1974 was not just facing expensive gas. It was facing something the economic textbooks of the time said was literally impossible. Economists in the post-war era had built their entire framework around a concept called the Phillips curve, the idea that inflation and unemployment always move in opposite directions. When inflation is high, unemployment is low. When unemployment rises, inflation falls. That was the rule. That was the certainty. That was what every government economist and central banker had staked their credibility on. And then stagflation showed up and burned the whole playbook to the ground. Stagflation means exactly what it sounds like: stagnation plus inflation. The economy stops growing, jobs start disappearing, and prices keep rising anyway. It's the worst possible combination because the tools you use to fight one make the other worse. If you raise interest rates to fight inflation, you kill what little economic growth is left. If you pump money into the economy to fight unemployment, you make inflation even savager. You're trapped. By 1974, the U.S. Consumer Price Index, the official measure of inflation, hit 11%. 11%. To put that in plain terms, if you had $100 in savings at the start of 1973, the purchasing power of that money had effectively collapsed. The things you needed, food, fuel, heating oil for your home, the cost of running a car, all of it was eating through people's wages faster than those wages could grow. For the first time in the post-war era, ordinary American workers were getting poorer in real terms, even while they were still employed. 500,000 Americans lost their jobs directly as a result of the energy crisis, according to a 1975 federal report to Congress. The GNP, the total economic output of the United States, fell by between $10 and $20 billion. The auto industry, which had been the crown jewel of American manufacturing for 30 years, went into free fall. In 1980, domestic car production dropped to its lowest level since the 1930s. Chrysler had to be bailed out by the federal government to survive, and consumers who had been loyal American car buyers for generations shifted en masse to fuel-efficient Japanese vehicles. By 1980, Japan had captured 25% of the American car market. An industry that seemed untouchable was hollowed out within less than a decade. And all of this, every single piece of it, traces back to one choke point, one narrow waterway, one vulnerability that was always there, but nobody wanted to face. Now stop for a moment, because this is the Vault Historian, and we don't just tell you what happened. We tell you the mechanics, the actual financial wiring underneath the historical event, because that's where the real lesson lives. Here is something most people watching news coverage of the Hormuz crisis today will never hear explained. The 1973 oil shock didn't just hurt America because gas got expensive. It hurt America because the entire post-war economic model had been secretly built on one quiet assumption: cheap energy is permanent. The suburban expansion after World War II, the highways, the tract housing, the two-car garages, the appliances, the manufacturing base, all of it was designed around oil costing $2 a barrel or less forever. The American dream, as it was physically constructed in the 1950s and 1960s, was an oil dream. And in 1973, that dream got an invoice it was never designed to pay. British families were going through a remarkably similar thing at the moment in time. Britain had its own inflation crisis running simultaneously. The National Union of Mine Workers went on strike in 1974, which combined with the oil shock to create what became known as the 3-day week, a government decree that commercial users of electricity could only operate for 3 consecutive days each week to conserve energy. 3 days a week. In 1974, in one of the most developed economies on Earth, offices running by candlelight, television shutting off at 10:30 at night, a country that had built an empire on industrial power reduced to rationing the electricity that powered it. And here is where it gets deeply personal, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. The people who lived through 1973 to 1979, your grandparents' generation in America and Britain, did not lose their wealth in a single dramatic crash that made a front-page news story. They lost it incrementally, Year after year, raise after raise that never quite kept up with prices, savings accounts that held steady in numbers but shrank in real purchasing power, pension funds that were promised one thing and delivered another, home values that rose on paper while the actual standard of living inside those homes quietly declined. It was a slow financial suffocation that never got its own dramatic news moment, but that permanently altered the trajectory of millions of families. Research on intergenerational wealth accumulation consistently shows that the cohort of Americans who entered their prime earning years between 1965 and 1975 accumulated significantly less real wealth over their lifetimes than the generation immediately before them, not because they worked less hard, not because they made worse decisions, but because the macroeconomic floor was pulled out from under their feet by forces completely beyond their control. That's what an oil shock actually does. Not the headline number, not the gas station queue, the slow, grinding, compounding destruction of purchasing power and opportunity that plays out over years.
And now, I want you to look at 2026, because the parallels are not comfortable. We are currently sitting with Brent crude prices that were at $64 a barrel before the Iran conflict began. They hit $125 during the Hormuz closure. Even with the ceasefire announced, analysts are warning that prices are unlikely to fall back to pre-war levels quickly. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, America's emergency oil buffer that was built specifically as a response to the 1973 crisis, has been significantly drawn down over the past several years. The cushion that was designed to absorb exactly this kind of shock is thinner than it has been in decades. Meanwhile, the U.S. Consumer Price Index never truly got back to the Federal Reserve's 2% target before this crisis hit. Core inflation was still running above where policymakers wanted it. The Fed had already been navigating an extremely narrow path between fighting inflation and avoiding a recession, and now an oil shock lands directly on top of that already fragile situation. In Britain, the picture is arguably even more precarious. GDP per capita, the real measure of whether ordinary people are getting better or worse off, was already falling before Hormuz. The UK debt-to-GDP ratio is approaching 100%. The Bank of England was already facing the same impossible trade-off that the Federal Reserve faced in 1974. Raise rates to fight inflation and risk tipping an already weakened economy into full recession, or hold back and watch prices accelerate. And Britain is significantly more exposed to energy price shocks than the United States because the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer and has substantial domestic insulation. Britain does not have that buffer. The word stagflation is back in every financial publication right now. The IMF has already flagged it as a key risk. Goldman Sachs analysts were using the S word in internal notes before the ceasefire was even announced. And if you understand what stagflation actually did to ordinary families in the 1970s, not the academic definition, but the lived financial reality, then you understand why that word should get your attention. But here is where the 1973 story gets even deeper. Because the oil shock did not just create an economic crisis, it created a political and financial architecture that reshaped the entire global monetary system in ways we are still living inside today. And this is the part of the 1973 story that almost nobody talks about. When the oil embargo hit and prices quadrupled, the oil exporting nations of the Middle East suddenly found themselves accumulating an almost incomprehensible amount of dollars. Their current account surpluses exploded. Saudi Arabia alone went from modest reserves to sitting on piles of petrodollars, literal American dollars paid for oil that dwarfed anything the country had previously managed. And all those dollars needed somewhere to go. Henry Kissinger and William Simon, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, saw this moment clearly. They engineered a deal, largely secret at the time, not fully documented until decades later, in which Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states would agree to price all oil sales globally in U.S. dollars and would recycle their oil revenues back into U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States would provide security guarantees and military protection to the Gulf monarchies.
That arrangement became known informally as the Petrodollar system, and it is the direct reason that the US dollar has maintained its status as the world's reserve currency for the past 50 years. Every country in the world that wants to buy oil, which is every country in the world, has to hold dollars to do it. That creates a permanent global demand for the US dollar that has allowed America to run trade deficits and government deficits that would have sunk any other nation long ago. The 1973 crisis, in other words, was not just a catastrophe. It was also the moment America locked in its financial dominance for the next half-century. Now look at what is happening in 2026. The Hormuz crisis is not just an oil price event, it is a direct challenge to that exact architecture. Iran has been explicitly working for years to move oil trade away from dollar denomination. China has been settling increasing amounts of oil purchases in yuan. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and their expanding membership, have been openly discussing reserve currency alternatives. The petrodollar system that was built on the rubble of the 1973 crisis is under more direct structural pressure than it has been in any point in the last 50 years. And here is the question that the Vault historian wants you to sit with. When the 1973 oil shock ended, America used the crisis to build a new financial architecture that extended its dominance for another 50 years. What architecture gets built from the rubble of the 2026 Hormuz crisis? Because someone will build something. The question is who and whether ordinary American and British families will be on the winning or the losing side of whatever comes next. Let me bring this home. Because everything we have covered, the 1973 embargo, the stagflation, the destroyed purchasing power, the petrodollar architecture, it all points to a set of specific, concrete things that happen to ordinary people's financial lives. And those things are directly relevant to what you should be thinking about right now. When the 1973 oil shock hit, the people who were most devastated were the ones who built their financial lives on the assumption that the world would keep working the way it always had. Fixed incomes, long-term bonds at fixed rates that inflation then devoured, savings accounts in currencies that were being inflated away, pension funds heavily weighted towards assets that performed terribly in inflationary environments. These were not foolish people. They were following the conventional wisdom of their time. The problem was that conventional wisdom had been built for a world that the oil shock permanently ended. The people who weathered it better, and there were people who weathered it better, tended to share certain characteristics. They held assets that had intrinsic value independent of any one currency. They maintained flexibility in how they earned and spent. They reduced their exposure to long-duration fixed obligations whose real value got eaten alive by inflation. And crucially, they understood what was happening at a structural level, not just the surface news story about gas prices, but the deeper financial shift underneath. This is why history matters, not as an academic exercise, not as trivia, but as a functional map of how economic forces actually work when they get pushed to their limits. The 1973 oil crisis did not come with a warning label. It did not arrive with instructions. It arrived the same way the Hormuz crisis arrived, suddenly, confusingly, with experts disagreeing about how serious it was and politicians providing more heat than light. The Federal Reserve in 1974 made decisions based on models that did not account for supply-side inflation shocks. They were fighting the wrong war with the wrong tools. It took until Paul Volcker arrived at the Fed in 1970 and deliberately engineered a brutal recession, pushing interest rates above 20% to finally break the inflation spiral. 20% interest rates. Think about what that does to mortgages. Think about what that does to business loans. Think about what that does to anyone carrying debt. The cure, in some ways, was as painful as the disease. And here is a question worth genuinely thinking about. We are now in 2026. The Fed is already navigating a difficult balancing act. Inflation was already stubborn before Hormuz. The oil shock adds a direct supply-side inflationary pressure that the Fed's interest rate tools are poorly designed to fight, because you can't drill more oil by raising interest rates. You can't reopen the Strait of Hormuz by adjusting the federal funds rate. The central bank faces the same fundamental problem Arthur Burns faced in 1974, with less political will, more public debt, and a financial system that has become significantly more complex and interconnected in the 50 years since the time. And also, there is a specific warning in the 1973 story that applies directly to the United Kingdom right now. Britain's vulnerability in 1973 and 1974 was compounded by one specific factor. The country was already carrying high government debt, already facing political instability, and already dealing with an industrial sector that was structurally weakened. The oil shock did not create those problems, it amplified them. It turned manageable difficulties into a crisis that forced the country to go to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout in 1976. An event so humiliating that Chancellor Dennis Healey was literally called back from Heathrow Airport to deal with the sterling crisis before he even got on the plane. Today, Britain's debt to GDP is approaching 100%. Growth is anemic. The oil shock hits an economy that was already running hot with underlying problems. The historical pattern says that when a vulnerable economy takes an external energy shock, the outcomes are not proportional to the size of the shock. They are amplified by the pre-existing weaknesses. A country in good financial health can absorb a price spike and recover. A country that was already stretched thin before the shock hits, that's where the damage compounds.
I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because this is exactly what the Vault historian exists to do. The people who understood what was structurally happening in 1973, not just the headline of an oil embargo, but the deeper economic architecture that was being tested and transformed. Those people were able to make better decisions. Not perfect decisions, not decisions that made them immune to the crisis, but decisions that meant they came out the other side with their financial lives intact in ways that the people who only watched the surface story did not. Here is what the 1973 story ultimately teaches us about 2026. Energy shocks do not end quickly. The 1973 embargo was lifted in March 1974, 5 months after it began, but the economic consequences played out for a decade. Oil prices stayed elevated. Inflation persisted. The structural changes to the global economy, the shift in industrial power, the changes to consumer behavior, the new financial architecture that got built in the crisis, those took years to fully work through. A ceasefire in Hormuz, even a permanent one, does not reset oil prices to $64 tomorrow. It does not instantly refill strategic reserves. It does not immediately dissolve the inflationary pressure that has already been injected into the supply chain over the past 6 weeks. History says the acute phase of an energy shock is dramatic and visible. The chronic phase is quiet and devastating. The 1973 generation felt the acute phase, the gas lines, the 3-day week, the headline inflation numbers. They mostly did not see the chronic phase coming, the slow erosion of purchasing power that lasted until the early 1980s, the way it quietly reset their retirement expectations, the way it permanently altered the trajectory of certain industries, certain regions, certain communities that never fully recovered. We have the advantage they did not. We have the history book. We know what chapter comes next, even if we do not know exactly how it reads. And that is the whole point of this channel, not to predict the future, but to understand the forces well enough that the future does not catch you completely off guard the way it caught millions of people in 1973. The Hormuz crisis has happened before. The mechanism is nearly identical. The players are different, the scale is larger. The global financial system is more interconnected and therefore more fragile in some ways and more resilient in others. But the fundamental dynamic, a sudden supply shock to the energy system that the global economy is structurally dependent on, arriving at a moment when inflation is already elevated and central banks are already constrained, that dynamic is not new. It has a historical record, and that record is worth taking seriously.
If this video made you think differently about what you're watching in the news right now, if it gave you a layer of understanding that goes deeper than the headline, then do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think the biggest parallel is between 1973 and today? Is it the inflation, the political instability, the challenge to dollar dominance? I genuinely want to know what struck you the most, because those conversations in the comments section are what make this community worth building. And if you know someone, a friend, a family member, a colleague, who is watching the Hormuz crisis and feeling confused or anxious about what it means for their financial life, share this video with them. Not because it has all the answers, but because understanding the historical context is the first step toward not being caught off guard. The 1973 generation did not have this. We do. Use it. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because we're just getting started. The history of how financial power actually works, how empires get rich, how currencies die, how ordinary people either get protected or get left behind by the forces moving above them. That is what the Vault historian is here to excavate every single week. The vault is open, and there's a lot more inside.